Rabaul, New Britain, August 1942. The air was thick with the scent of salt and oil. Tropical humidity hung heavy over the Japanese stronghold. A city-turned fortress, where officers in pressed uniforms stood along the coastal ridge, squinting toward the northern horizon. At first, there was only the faint glimmer of sunlight bouncing off metal. Then the distant throb of engines. Steady, synchronized, unhurried. 12 dark silhouettes emerged through the haze, flying in perfect formation. The officers laughed. "American toys," one remarked, confident that no lumbering bomber could breach the iron ring of Rabaul's defenses. Anti-aircraft gunners readied their batteries, while Zero fighters took to the sky, their engines shrieking like hornets. But the fortresses did not turn back. They climbed higher, methodical, relentless, until they hovered above the clouds, immune to interception. And then, with mechanical precision, their bomb bay doors opened. A moment of stillness. Then the earth erupted. Flames consumed the harbor. Oil tanks split open like bursting veins. The laughter stopped. Above the smoke, the flying fortresses turned homeward. Slow, scarred, but unbeaten. Their message was clear. The age of mockery was over. In the mid-1930s, long before the Pacific skies filled with fire, a small group of engineers at the Boeing Aircraft Company in Seattle dreamed of a machine that could carry war across oceans. They called it the Model 299, a four-engine bomber that dwarfed everything before it. Reporters who saw it on its first test flight in 1935 nicknamed it the Flying Fortress, after spotting the multiple gun ports glinting along its fuselage. The name stuck. At the time, the U.S. Army Air Corps was still modest, overshadowed by European air forces experimenting with faster fighters and dive bombers. Yet America's strategists clung to a bold idea that wars could be won from the air. Precision daylight bombing, they believed, could cripple an enemy's factories, ports, and spirit without the need for long ground campaigns. It was theory untested and controversial. But as tensions deepened across Asia, the blueprint for that theory would soon find its battlefield. By 1937, Japan's invasion of China had demonstrated the brutal reach of air power. Bombers flattened Shanghai and Nanking while the world watched. The message was clear. Control of the sky would determine control of the war. In Washington, the message resonated. Boeing's design evolved rapidly. The B-17B, then the C, then the E model, each version stronger, faster, and armed with more machine guns. When war finally erupted in Europe in 1939, a handful of these aircraft were ready, but their full potential was still unknown. Then came Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Several B-17s were en route to Hawaii that morning, arriving just as Japanese bombers attacked. Some were destroyed on the ground, others barely escaped the chaos. Within hours, the United States found itself thrust into a Pacific war it had not fully prepared for. Japan's conquests moved with terrifying speed. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and Malaya fell within months. The Imperial Japanese Navy ruled the seas. Its Zero fighters dominated the skies. To many in Tokyo, American air power seemed laughable, a collection of slow, underdefended bombers scattered across remote bases. Yet, hidden within that chaos, a handful of flying fortresses were already being assembled and ferried to the Pacific. They were few in number, often fewer than a dozen operational aircraft per theater, but their presence carried weight far beyond their size. In early 1942, B-17s of the 19th Bomb Group began operating from bases in northern Australia and the island of Java. Their mission, to strike back at Japan's rapidly expanding perimeter targets like shipping convoys, airfields, and supply depots. The results were mixed. The distances were immense, the weather unforgiving, and Japanese fighters merciless. Many B-17s never returned. Engines overheated. Navigation failed. Fuel ran dry before home could be reached. But for the few that made it back, their battered fuselages told a different story, one of durability and defiance. Crews spoke of limping home on one engine, of entire control surfaces shredded by gunfire, of gunners firing until barrels glowed red. The myth of invincibility was being born not through victory, but through survival. In Tokyo, intelligence officers studied the reports. The aircraft was impressive, yes, but slow. Could be intercepted. Its bombs, they claimed, rarely hit precise targets. They concluded that the Flying Fortress was a psychological weapon more than a practical one. And so, Japanese officers laughed. They believed their island fortresses, carved into mountains and jungles, could withstand anything the Americans could send. Their confidence was built on months of unbroken success. But as spring turned to summer in 1942, something began to shift. American industry was awakening. New factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach produced hundreds of B-17s every month. Training schools filled with fresh crews, many barely out of college. The tide of metal and manpower had begun to rise. In the skies above New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, those early, scattered bombers would soon become the harbingers of a relentless aerial campaign. One that would test Japan's pride, its technology, and its will. The stage was set for the fortresses to prove their name, not through theory or propaganda, but through fire. By mid-1942, the balance of the Pacific War was shifting subtly but unmistakably. Japan's advance, once unstoppable, had begun to slow, and overhead, in the deep blue skies above New Guinea, a new sound echoed, the low, unbroken hum of American bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress had arrived in force. Their first major missions were far from glamorous. Flying from rough coral runways in northern Australia and Port Moresby, the crews faced heat that warped instruments, rain that blinded pilots, and tropical diseases that spread through tents faster than news. But despite the conditions, the targets were clear, the Japanese footholds at La Salamaua and Rabaul. Each sortie was a gamble. The B-17 was designed for high-altitude, daylight precision bombing, ideal for European skies, not for Pacific storms or jungle terrain. Yet necessity forced improvisation. Crews flew lower, often under cloud cover, and relied on visual navigation over endless ocean. The Japanese were quick to respond. Mitsubishi A-6M0s, fast and agile, could climb rapidly to meet the fortresses. In those early encounters, the difference in philosophy between the two air forces became clear. The Zeros represented agility, speed, maneuverability, and offense. The fortresses represented endurance, armor, firepower, and the belief that formation discipline could overcome chaos. It was a clash of two worlds, the swift sword against the immovable shield. Early missions were brutal. B-17s were ripped apart in midair by concentrated fighter attacks. Some crews bailed out over the sea. Others vanished entirely. At one point, Japanese newspapers mocked the American flying coffins, claiming that U.S. airmen were throwing away machines faster than they could build them. But behind the headlines, a different pattern was emerging. The Japanese pilots who returned from these engagements carried unsettling stories. They reported bombers that refused to fall, even when streaming fire. They spoke of gunner positions that raked the sky with tracer fire, making head-on attacks suicidal. And they noticed that, despite heavy losses, the raids continued almost weekly. For Japan's commanders, this persistence was unnerving. In August 1942, as American Marines landed on Guadalcanal, B-17s began pounding the Japanese bases that supported their counteroffensives. The fortresses flew from Townsville, Port Moresby, and later from Espiritu Santo, striking harbors and airfields deep behind enemy lines. They were not yet accurate enough to destroy entire fleets, but their psychological effect was profound. For the first time since the war began, Japanese soldiers were forced to look up, to wonder when the next raid would come, and whether their bunkers would hold. Each mission was a test of endurance. Crews sat for 10-hour flights in suffocating heat, oxygen masks freezing at high altitude, their ears ringing from the roar of engines. Some planes came home with wings shredded, fuselages riddled with holes, or landing gear jammed. Yet even in these conditions, the fortresses began to prove what their name promised, that they could take punishment and still deliver it back. By late 1942, the Allied command saw the first tangible results. Bombing runs on Rabaul's harbor crippled supply convoys and sank transport ships that Japan desperately needed to sustain its island garrisons. B-17s also hit airstrips, fuel depots, and ammunition dumps. Each raid weakened the imperial supply chain that stretched thousands of miles from Tokyo to the South Pacific. The Japanese began to reinforce Rabaul's defenses, adding more anti-aircraft batteries, radar installations, and fighter patrols. But no matter how heavy the defenses grew, the bombers returned. Still, the skepticism persisted. Some U.S. commanders questioned whether the B-17 was truly suited for the Pacific. Its range was limited compared to what the vast theater demanded. And though it could deliver powerful blows, the bombs often scattered wide over jungle-covered targets. It would take time, and the arrival of new tactics, before the fortresses would deliver the devastating precision their name implied. But the foundations were laid. The Japanese had underestimated American resolve. They had mocked the Flying Fortress as an oversized, slow-moving target. Now they began to realize that behind those silver wings lay a doctrine, a belief that no fortress was unbreakable except the one in the sky. In the months ahead, that belief would be tested against their strongest citadel, the volcanic bastion of Rabaul itself. The laughter would soon fade under the thunder of bombs. The B-17 was not born from desperation but from design genius. The strength lay not in speed, but in structure. Every inch of its airframe was built around the idea of survival. The wings were thick and rigid, the fuselage reinforced with aluminum ribs, and its 4 Wright Cyclone engines gave it endurance unmatched by any bomber of its time. In an era when most aircraft carried a handful of machine guns, the B-17 bristled with defensive power, up to 13.50 caliber Browning guns mounted in every direction, could fight off attackers from nose to tail, turning the air around it into a deadly sphere of lead. When grouped in tight formation, each plane's fields of fire overlapped, creating what crews called a combat box, a moving fortress wall. For Japanese pilots accustomed to cutting through unarmed bombers in China, it was a shocking new reality. A single pass through a B-17 formation could mean flying into a storm of tracers that shredded wings and engines alike. But its most astonishing feature was its resilience. Crews told stories of bombers limping back over the Coral Sea with entire control surfaces missing, or engines shot clean off their mounts. Photographs from repair depots showed aircraft riddled with hundreds of bullet holes yet somehow intact. For the Americans, these machines were more than tools. They were symbols of faith in engineering and teamwork. For the Japanese, they were a reminder that no enemy could be underestimated. Inside that machine of steel and fire sat 10 men, each with a role that could mean life or death. The pilot and co-pilot wrestled against turbulence and flak bursts. The navigator and bombardier worked in the glass nose, scanning the horizon for landmarks and enemy fighters. The radio operator kept a lifeline open to base, if signals could break through the static. And scattered through the fuselage were the gunners, perched in plexiglass turrets or crouched by open windows, watching for the faint glint of sunlight that meant an approaching zero. Temperatures at altitude plunged below freezing. Oxygen masks often froze over. Gunners lost feeling in their hands. The deafening roar of the engines was constant, turning every mission into an endurance trial. For Japanese airmen trained to sea war as a test of spirit and sacrifice, the B-17 crews represented something alien. A mechanical brotherhood where discipline and procedure replaced personal valor. Every action was calculated, rehearsed, measured. The crew functioned not as individuals but as one body the Flying Fortress itself made human. And yet, fear was never far away. Many airmen flew their missions with the knowledge that survival was a matter of odds, not skill. Those who returned carried with them an unspoken understanding that every flight could be their last. The Pacific sky had no mercy. A single engine fire, a burst of flak, or a mid-air collision could erase a crew in seconds. Yet they climbed back into the bomb bays again and again, not out of pride, but out of duty. By 1943, these men had earned a quiet reputation among ground troops. Soldiers on the islands would stop and look up when the fortresses passed overhead, watching them trace slow, steady lines across the clouds. They were symbols of persistence, of the long arm of retribution that could reach even the most distant enemy stronghold. To Japan's military leadership, the arrival of the Flying Fortress was initially met with disdain. Their pilots, especially those of the elite Tainan Air Group, believed that speed and maneuver were the ultimate virtues in aerial combat. The Zero embodied that belief, light, elegant, and deadly in the hands of a skilled aviator. When they first engaged the B-17s over La and Rabaul, they expected easy kills. The bombers were slow, predictable, and heavy, but reality soon contradicted expectation. The Zeros could close in quickly, but not safely. Each attack run turned into a deadly gauntlet. The gunners aboard the B-17s learned to anticipate head-on assaults, focusing overlapping firepower on incoming fighters. Pilots who survived the encounters returned shaken, describing the sky as filled with fire. Japanese intelligence officers began to take note. Reports from the front described bombers that absorbed damage disproportionate to normal aircraft. Engineers studied wreckage, trying to understand how American design philosophy had produced such durability. For the first time, Japan's high command began to fear what American industry could do on a larger scale. If these were the bombers of 1942, what would come next? Still, propaganda demanded confidence. Newspapers continued to print triumphant headlines. Commanders mocked the flying fortresses as noisy failures, until the day those same bombers shattered the docks of Rabaul and left warehouses burning from end to end. The laughter had been easy when victory seemed certain. But as Japan's empire stretched thin and its airfields fell under repeated bombardment, the flying fortress became more than a nuisance. It became an omen, the promise that the sky itself was turning against them. Each encounter between Fortress and Zero was not just a duel of machines, but a collision of philosophies. Precision against passion, endurance against arrogance. And in the crucible of that conflict, both sides would evolve, one through adaptation, the other through realization. The lessons were only beginning to unfold. When the first B-17 missions began in the Pacific, the bombers flew alone or in small groups, easy prey for Japanese fighters. Many crews never made it home. But by late 1942, lessons from blood and wreckage had shaped a new approach: formation discipline. American commanders realized that the B-17's greatest defense lay not in its armor, but in its unity. Crews trained to fly in precise geometric patterns, staggered boxes of bombers stacked at different altitudes. Each aircraft's guns protected the blind spots of another, forming a moving fortress wall in the sky. When Zeros attacked from above or behind, they were met not by one gunner, but by dozens. The formation could absorb losses, yet continue to strike with deadly accuracy. The tactics were refined further by combat reports from Europe. Crews flying over Germany shared insights on fighter engagement, altitude advantage, and bomb run timing. The Pacific groups, though fewer in number, adapted quickly. By 1943, B-17s operating from Port Moresby and later WWII in New Guinea had become far deadlier. They flew higher, maintained radio silence to avoid interception, and used cloud cover to mask their approach. Fighter escorts, first P-39s, later P-38 Lightnings, began to join them on longer raids. Japanese interceptors found themselves facing not unorganized targets, but coordinated aerial machines. The old tactics of diving and circling were replaced by desperate frontal attacks, often suicidal. The once confident laughter of Japanese airmen gave way to frustration. Every sortie against the fortresses drained fuel, planes, and pilots, resources Japan could no longer replace easily. In contrast, American production lines continued to flow, sending new aircraft and spare parts across the Pacific like a mechanical tide. Each new wave of B-17s arrived tougher, more refined, and more numerous. What had begun as a handful of bombers fighting for survival was becoming an armada of endurance. In war, fear travels faster than bullets, and the flying fortress carried fear as surely as it carried bombs. For the Japanese, accustomed to dominating the skies in the early months of the war, the B-17 became a haunting presence. Its sound, that deep, rolling drone of 4 synchronized engines, was unmistakable. Soldiers at Rabaul and La would freeze when they heard it, staring upward as dark crosses appeared through the clouds. They knew what came next: the long whistle of falling bombs, the delayed, bone-shaking impact, then the silence that followed, broken only by the hiss of burning oil and the groan of collapsing steel. Psychologically, the fortresses did more than destroy buildings, they shattered certainty. The belief that Japan's fortresses were untouchable, that its defenses could repel anything, was crumbling. Even when the bombs missed their targets, the effect was devastating. Each raid forced the Japanese to scatter men, resources, and anti-aircraft guns across wide territories. Work stopped at airfields, factories, and docks during alerts. Convoys hesitated to move. The fortresses were rewriting the rhythm of war. For American crews, too, the psychological battle was immense. Every mission meant hours of tension. The waiting, the sudden flash of flak, the scream of attacking fighters. Crews measured success not in victories, but in survival. Yet each time they returned, the knowledge that they had delivered their payload and come home alive hardened their resolve. The fortresses were not invincible, far from it, but they were indomitable. And that distinction carried a different kind of power. As one Japanese officer later admitted, the Flying Fortress did not conquer us in numbers, but in spirit. In the grand design of the Pacific War, the B-17 was never the final word, it was the prologue. Its raids, though limited in scale, established the principles that would define Allied air power for the rest of the conflict. First, they proved that strategic bombing was viable even across the Pacific's vast distances. Bases could be built, supply chains could be maintained, and bombers could project force from thousands of miles away. Second, they demonstrated the psychological and logistical drain that consistent air raids could impose on an enemy spread thin across multiple fronts. By mid-1943, B-17s were slowly being replaced by the longer-range B-24 Liberator, which could carry heavier payloads and reach farther into enemy territory. But the doctrine, the faith in massed, coordinated bombing, remained. It was the same doctrine that would later find its ultimate expression in the B-29 superfortress raids over Japan's home islands. The B-17's legacy was not measured in the tonnage it dropped, but in the paradigm it created, a new kind of warfare that combined engineering, strategy, and industrial will into one relentless force. Japan learned this the hard way. The strongholds once thought invulnerable were being pounded daily, not by fleets or armies, but by small crews of determined airmen in cold aluminum shells. The Flying Fortress had taught a generation of pilots and generals that the battlefield no longer ended at the horizon. The sky itself had become a weapon. Each of these angles, technology, humanity, enemy perception, tactics, and psychology, was a piece of the same revelation. That war in the Pacific was not just a clash of nations, but a test of endurance between two visions of air power. The next stage would make that test unmistakable, when hundreds of fortresses converged on Rabaul, and laughter turned to disbelief. Rabaul, New Britain, October 1942. The morning sun rose behind Mount Teverver, casting long shadows over one of Japan's most fortified strongholds in the Pacific. The harbor below was crowded with transports, destroyers, and oil tankers. Barracks clung to the hillsides. Bunkers were dug deep into volcanic rock. To Tokyo, Rabaul was the Gibraltar of the Pacific, the key to holding New Guinea and the Solomons. At precisely 0930 hours, the sound began, faint at first, then unmistakable. For engines, low and powerful, drumming across the bay. Spotters shouted. Sirens wailed. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their guns. Through the thin mist over the water, 12 dark silhouettes appeared. B-17s, flying in flawless formation, the sunlight glinting off their silver wings. For the men below, the sight was at once awe-inspiring and terrifying. The fortresses were high, too high for small arms fire, yet within range of the heavy guns ringing the harbor. Shells exploded in black bursts across the sky, but the bombers held their course, unshaken, methodical. The lead bombardier peered through his Norden bombsight, a masterpiece of 1930s technology that could calculate trajectories with chilling precision. The crosshairs steadied over the docks. Bombs away. From the ground, the sight was almost unreal. Tiny dark specks detached from the bellies of the aircraft, falling silently, almost lazily. Then, seconds later, the world tore apart. The first wave hit the oil storage tanks, Great pillars of flame rose hundreds of feet into the air. The second wave struck the shipping pier, splintering cranes and setting warehouses ablaze. A transport ship, the Kiyomaru, took a direct hit and erupted in a column of smoke that could be seen for miles. Japanese officers who had once mocked the flying fortresses now watched helplessly as their supply lifeline vanished in fire and thunder. Zero fighters scrambled from Bunakana airfield, but by the time they reached altitude, the fortresses were already turning south, their bomb bays empty, their mission complete. The Japanese chased them anyway, diving, firing, desperate to claim revenge. But the bombers flew in tight formation, weaving slowly, gunners firing bursts that filled the air with streaks of light. Several Zeros were hit. Others simply broke off, unable to close the distance. By the time the last fortress disappeared into the clouds, Rabaul was burning. That single raid, one of several during the autumn of 1942, marked a turning point not just in the Pacific Air War, but in Japanese perception. The myth of invulnerability was broken. Reports to Tokyo were grim. Fuel reserves destroyed, docks crippled, and morale shaken. The B-17s had achieved what few thought possible, striking deep into Japan's Pacific bastion and escaping alive. But the victory was not only tactical. It was symbolic. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Allies had proven they could take the fight to Japan's doorstep. The era of defense was ending. The age of counteroffensive had begun. In the weeks that followed, the fortresses returned again and again. Night and day, through cloud and monsoon, they dropped their payloads with relentless regularity. Sometimes they missed. Often they didn't. Rabaul's once bustling harbor became a graveyard of ships. Its airfields turned into craters. Every raid carried a message, not only to the Japanese, but to the world, that industrial might and human endurance could defy the odds. For the crews of the 19th and 43rd Bomb Groups, those missions came at a heavy cost. Many did not return. Planes vanished into the sea, engines aflame, their final radio calls fading into static. But the survivors knew what their sacrifice meant. Each successful bombing run weakened Japan's logistical heart, tightening the ring around its empire. From Rabaul to La, from Salamaua to Kavieng, the Flying Fortress carved its legend one crater at a time. The laughter that once echoed through Japanese briefing rooms had turned to silence and fear. The enemy they had dismissed as clumsy and overconfident was now methodically dismantling their empire from the sky. Yet even as the fortresses struck with precision, new challenges loomed on the horizon. Japan was adapting, learning, fortifying. And as the war spread deeper into the Pacific, the Americans would need more range, more payload, and more power to keep the pressure alive. The Flying Fortress had proven its worth, but its greatest test was still ahead. Port Moresby, New Guinea, November 1942. Rain hammered the metal roofs of the airbase. The jungle beyond the runway steamed in the tropical heat. Mechanics in drenched uniforms worked by floodlight, wading through mud, patching bullet holes, and reloading ammunition belts. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and determination. Inside a dim operations tent, a small group of pilots huddled around a map pinned to a wooden board. Red strings stretched across the Solomon Sea, tracing routes toward Rabaul, La, and Buna. The distance was daunting. Fuel margins were razor-thin. One mistake, one headwind, and a fortress could vanish into the ocean with no chance of rescue. The mission briefing was short and brutal. Target, Rabaul. Again. Objective, cripple the Japanese reinforcements moving through the harbor. Expected resistance, heavy. Colonel Saunders, commander of the 43rd Bomb Group, looked over his men. Most were in their early 20s, some barely old enough to shave. But in their eyes burned a quiet resolve that no speech could match. "Gentlemen," he said, "you know the target. You know the risks. Let's make it count." By dawn, the airbase came alive. Engines roared to life, the ground vibrating as the B-17s lined up for takeoff. 30 tons of steel, fuel, and courage. Each fortress lumbered down the runway, rising slowly into the storm-darkened sky. Hours later, over the Solomon Sea, the formation ran into trouble. Heavy clouds swallowed the bombers whole, scattering them across the expanse. Lightning flashed, rain lashed the windows, and turbulence tossed the planes like toys. Radio chatter crackled, disoriented voices, coordinates lost to static. Some crews turned back. Others pressed on, relying on instinct and dead reckoning. Then, as if by fate, the clouds broke. And there it was, Rabaul, still smoking from the last raid, yet alive with new defenses. Dozens of anti-aircraft guns now ringed the harbor. Patrol boats circled the bay. Zeros waited at altitude, shimmering like silver predators in the sun. The lead B-17, San Antonio rose, rolled into position. Below, tracer fire rose in red and white arcs. The sky itself seemed to catch fire. But the fortresses didn't flinch. One by one, they held formation, engines screaming against the wind, bomb bay doors yawning open. The first wave dropped. Massive explosions rippled through the docks. Flames erupted from a fuel depot, engulfing nearby ships. The second wave came under ferocious attack. A burst of flak tore through Blondie, ripping open its right wing. Smoke trailed behind it as the crew fought to stay level. The co-pilot, bleeding from shrapnel, gritted his teeth and kept his hands on the controls. "Stay with her," the captain shouted. "We're not going home empty." They dropped their payload, direct hit on a destroyer refueling at the pier. The explosion shattered windows across the city. Moments later, Blondie began to lose altitude, trailing smoke into the sea. No parachutes, just a flash and then nothing. From above, the other crews saw it happen and pressed on, fueled by fury. The third wave turned inland, striking supply depots and barracks near the airfield. Japanese gunners fired wildly, the air filled with the thunder of overlapping detonations. By the time the last fortress released its bombs, the sky was a maelstrom of fire and shrapnel. Zeros dove through the smoke, guns blazing. The fortress gunners answered in kind, .50 caliber tracers tearing across the air. A Zero exploded mid-dive, spinning into the harbor. Another clipped a B-17's tail before bursting into flame. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes, but to those inside the bombers it felt like an eternity. When the fortresses finally broke free of the flak zone, only 8 of the original 12 remained. Engines sputtered, fuselages scarred, oxygen systems shredded, and yet they were alive. Back at Port Moresby, the survivors limped in one by one. Crews rushed out onto the muddy runway, counting each returning plane in silence. When the last one touched down, a ragged cheer went up. Not a victory, but survival. That night, as the men gathered around tin cups of coffee, word came through reconnaissance photos. Rabaul's harbor was in ruins. 3 destroyers sunk. 2 cargo ships ablaze. Oil tanks gone. The cost had been terrible, but the mission had succeeded. It was the kind of victory that didn't make headlines, yet quietly shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. In that moment, under the flickering lamps of a jungle base, the crews of the 43rd Bomb Group understood something profound. They weren't just fighting a war of bombs and bullets. They were fighting for momentum, for the right to move forward. And that they had won. Rabaul, December 1942. Smoke still hung over the city like a permanent storm. The once proud Japanese bastion, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was now a graveyard of twisted metal, sunken ships, and scorched concrete. What had begun as laughter in the officers' mess had turned into a long silence broken only by the echo of distant bombers. For the Japanese command, the humiliation was undeniable. Each raid exposed vulnerabilities they refused to acknowledge. Rabaul, meant to project power across the Pacific, was instead becoming a liability, a magnet for destruction. The raids had forced the Imperial Navy to withdraw critical ships from frontline duties just to defend the base. Dozens of Zero fighters were being lost weekly. Anti-aircraft ammunition was running low. And still, the Americans kept coming. From the skies above, reconnaissance crews reported a sight that stunned analysts at Allied headquarters. Rabaul's once bustling harbor was eerily quiet. Damaged vessels lay half-submerged in oily water, cranes frozen mid-collapse, piers splintered and blackened. It was a psychological turning point as much as a tactical one. The myth of Japanese invincibility, the aura that had carried them through Pearl Harbor, Singapore, and the Philippines, was beginning to crack. The Flying Fortress had done more than drop bombs. It had pierced morale. Meanwhile, in the United States, Boeing Plant No. 2, Seattle, production lines roared with the sound of drills and rivet guns. Women in overalls and kerchiefs worked shoulder to shoulder with engineers and veterans turned trainers. Each rivet struck into the silver hull of a new B-17 was more than metal. It was defiance forged in aluminum. Posters along the walls read, "Keep them flying." Photographs of the 43rd Bomb Group, tattered and sun-bleached, were pinned near assembly lines. Every worker who looked at them understood that somewhere, thousands of miles away, these machines were changing the tide of war. When the next wave of B-17s rolled out of the factory doors, they carried not just bombs, but the will of an entire nation that refused to yield. Back in the Pacific, the raids escalated. By January 1943, the B-17s of the 5th Air Force had developed new tactics. Skip bombing runs, flying low across the waves, releasing bombs that bounced like stones into Japanese ships. The results were devastating. At Rabaul, 2 more destroyers were sunk. Several cargo ships exploded under direct hits. Oil fires burned for days, visible from miles out at sea. What stunned the Japanese most wasn't the accuracy, it was the persistence. Every time they rebuilt, the fortresses returned. Every time they laughed, the sky answered. In Tokyo, senior officers at Imperial General Headquarters studied the reports in grim silence. The calculations were clear. Rabaul could no longer function as a safe harbor. It was under siege from the air, a position Japan had never imagined possible so early in the war. The once celebrated term, Flying Fortress, once dismissed with arrogance, now carried a weight of dread. Japanese propaganda had to shift tone. No longer were these machines mocked, they were described as formidable, even fearsome. American intelligence intercepted radio chatter where pilots referred to the B-17s as the Iron Demons. And yet, behind every success lay an unbearable price. In Port Moresby, rows of crude wooden crosses began to appear near the airstrip. Crews who hadn't made it back, men with names now carved into grainy planks, became silent markers of the cost of progress. Each mission demanded more courage, more endurance, more sacrifice. The laughter of the enemy had turned into respect, but respect alone didn't bring the fallen home. Still, the survivors flew. Every sortie now carried a symbolic weight. To prove that even in the face of relentless loss, America could not be intimidated, that technology, training, and human resolve combined could alter the course of a global war. By mid-1943, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. The Japanese grip on the Solomon Islands was weakening. The B-17s, once flying alone, were now joined by faster B-24 Liberators, expanding the range and devastation of Allied bombing campaigns. From Rabaul to WWII and Truk Lagoon, the pattern was the same: fortresses of empire reduced to ashes. But for the men who had been there from the beginning, those who had watched the first laughter from the ridges of Rabaul, there was no celebration, only reflection. They had seen what it took to break arrogance. Precision, patience, and persistence. The fortresses had done more than win a battle. They had changed the rhythm of war itself, turning the skies into a new kind of battlefield where distance and altitude mattered more than the number of ships in a fleet. As one pilot later wrote in his journal, "We didn't just bomb Rabaul. We bombed an idea that anyone could own the sky." The smoldering wreckage of Rabaul stood as proof of that. A place once filled with laughter and certainty now echoed only with wind and ruin. And in that silence, history had turned. Rabaul, early 1943. The city no longer resembled the jewel of Japan's Pacific Empire. The once bustling harbor, where supply ships and war convoys had come and gone in endless rhythm, was now a graveyard beneath the waves. Twisted cranes jutted from the water at odd angles. Hulls of destroyers rusted and cracked, and the air reeked of oil and salt. For weeks, the fires burned. From Allied reconnaissance aircraft circling miles above, the smoke from Rabaul looked like a black wound across the ocean. a reminder that even the mightiest fortress could bleed. By the time the final assessment came in, the numbers told a story of devastation. 12 major warships destroyed or crippled. Dozens of transports and auxiliary vessels lost. Nearly 200 aircraft wiped out in combat or on the ground. Over 2,000 Japanese personnel killed or missing. The Allied losses, though far lighter, were deeply personal. Each missing fortress meant 10 men gone, and each survivor carried the weight of those who didn't return. Yet the impact of these raids stretched far beyond Rabaul itself. Strategically, the Japanese command was forced into a defensive posture across the entire South Pacific. For the first time since the war began, Japan's expansion had stopped. Rabaul, once their forward command post for operations in New Guinea and the Solomons, was no longer safe. Supply routes had to be rerouted through Truk Lagoon, hundreds of miles away. Every new convoy risked ambush by American aircraft. The shift was seismic. The Pacific, once dominated by the rising sun, began to tilt westward, toward Allied momentum. In Washington, D.C., the news filtered back to command rooms filled with cigar smoke and maps marked with red pins. Generals and analysts studied the reconnaissance photos with quiet satisfaction. They showed not just destruction, but proof that air power alone could achieve what armies once required months to accomplish. General George C. Kenney of the 5th Air Force described it bluntly. Rabaul has been hit where it hurts most, in its pride and in its ports. The fortresses did what no fleet could. It was more than a military statement. It was a philosophical one. The age of naval supremacy had met its rival in the skies. Across the Pacific, American morale soared. Newspaper headlines read, "Flying Fortresses Smash Rabaul." Photos of the bombers, their noses painted with names like Hell's Angels and Knockout Dropper, became symbols of endurance. For Japan, it was the opposite. Radio Tokyo fell silent on Rabaul. Propaganda broadcasts that once boasted of impenetrable defenses now spoke vaguely of temporary setbacks. The laughter that had filled officers' clubs a year earlier was replaced by unease. The myth had shattered. On the ground, surviving Japanese troops labored day and night to rebuild airfields and repair ships, but it was a losing battle. Every new construction effort drew another wave of fortresses. The Americans were no longer testing their range. They were perfecting dominance. What began as a handful of daring raids had evolved into a sustained campaign of precision and attrition. Rabaul, cut off and under siege from the air, became what one Japanese officer later called a prison without walls. By mid-1943, Rabaul had ceased to function as a major naval base. It remained occupied, yes, but trapped, isolated, irrelevant. The Imperial Command could no longer project power from it. The fortress city had become the opposite of its name. Thousands of miles away, in Allied airfields from New Guinea to Guadalcanal, the B-17s were gradually replaced by newer, longer-range aircraft. But their legacy remained visible in the faces of every mechanic, every gunner, every pilot who had seen Rabaul burn. They had proven that courage and coordination could defy the odds, that even when the enemy laughed, determination could answer louder. The Flying Fortress had earned its name the hard way. Not through design alone, but through endurance, the kind that could survive the flak, the fire, and the disbelief of those who thought it could never happen. And though many of those planes would never return to base, their impact was carved permanently into the course of the war, and into the consciousness of both sides. The laughter of 1942 had become the silence of 1943. A silence that would soon echo across the Pacific once more, as the fortress's successors carried the fight even deeper into Japan's empire. Tokyo, spring 1943. In the polished corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters, the mood was no longer triumphant. Maps that once gleamed with red arrows of conquest were now smudged with black ink. Defensive lines, fallback routes, desperate supply chains. Rabaul's name appeared often in reports, but no longer as a forward bastion. It was now a liability, a constant reminder of vulnerability. A senior naval staff officer wrote in his diary, "We underestimated the enemy's persistence and their machines. The Flying Fortress, once dismissed as slow and fragile, had rewritten Japan's understanding of air warfare. Its combination of altitude, defensive firepower, and range had proven devastating, not just tactically but psychologically. Rabaul's fall marked more than the loss of a base. It shattered the illusion that Japan could protect its empire through sheer will and naval power alone. For the first time, officers in Tokyo began to whisper about the unthinkable, that the war could, in time, be lost. At Allied headquarters in Brisbane, General Douglas MacArthur and General George C. Kenney studied reconnaissance imagery of the raids with sharp satisfaction. The photographs revealed devastation so complete that MacArthur's staff labeled Rabaul a non-operational threat. Kenney, the architect behind many of the B-17 raids, took the opportunity to press a radical idea: bypass Rabaul entirely. Starve it, isolate it, and move northward. There was no need to invade what was already dying. It was a concept that would later shape the entire Pacific strategy: island hopping. Instead of meeting every fortress head-on, the Allies would leapfrog past them, cutting off supply lines and letting them wither. Rabaul was the first test of that doctrine, and it worked. By early 1944, the once mighty stronghold was effectively neutralized. Its defenders, nearly 100,000 Japanese troops, sat stranded, unable to resupply or retreat. Allied bombers ruled the air above, but the Americans never needed to set foot on its soil again. Rabaul had become a ghost. For the men who had fought there, the psychological transformation was profound. Veterans of the 43rd and 90th bomb groups, who had once flown into battle with uncertain odds, began to see the broader picture. Each mission, each scarred wing and bullet hole, had been part of something far greater: the slow, methodical breaking of an empire's pride. The laughter they'd once imagined echoing from Rabaul's officers' quarters was long gone. Now, when the bombers flew over the Pacific, Japanese positions opened fire in desperation, not confidence. The fortresses had done what even naval armadas couldn't. They had forced a superpower to retreat behind its own myth. On the home front, the impact was equally powerful. In the United States, stories of the Rabaul raids appeared in Life magazine and newsreels shown in theaters. Americans watched grainy black and white footage of B-17s crossing vast oceanic distances, surviving walls of flak, and returning scarred but victorious. The narrative was clear: courage and technology, when united by purpose, could overcome even the most entrenched enemy. One reporter described the bombers as flying symbols of American stubbornness. That phrase would soon echo across the Pacific. Even within the military, the lessons were profound. The Rabaul campaign had proven that air power could independently cripple strategic targets. It changed procurement priorities, shifted budgets, and redefined command structures. The age of the long-range bomber had fully arrived. Without the successes and sacrifices of Rabaul, the later firebombing campaigns over Japan, and even the atomic missions, might have followed a very different trajectory. By the time the war's tide turned fully in 1944 and 1945, the B-17 had already passed its torch to newer aircraft like the B-24 and the B-29. Yet among the men who had flown through the hell of Rabaul, there remained a shared belief that they had been part of the moment when history itself had changed altitude. The fortress had proven its name not through invincibility, but through endurance, through the ability to carry on when everything, even reason, said it couldn't. And in that endurance lay the death knell of Japan's forward empire. The ruins of Rabaul still stand today, half consumed by jungle. Rusted gun barrels peer through the foliage. Concrete bunkers crumble beneath vines. It is a silent monument to an era when pride met persistence, and persistence won. The laughter that once echoed across those ridges was long ago buried under ash and time. But the echo of the fortresses remains, in history books, in the roar of engines remembered by old men, and in the cold truth that air power had changed the face of war forever. War has many sounds: the crash of shells, the whistle of bullets, the cry of men. But in the Pacific of 1942 and 1943, it was the deep, rhythmic hum of the Flying Fortress that carried meaning far beyond the battlefields. For the men on the ground, Japanese soldiers staring up from the shattered docks of Rabaul, that sound was a prophecy. It signaled that distance was no longer safety, and that the sky itself had become a weapon. For the men inside those aircraft, young, sleepless, often terrified, it was something else entirely. The vibration beneath their boots, the steady growl of 4 engines, was the heartbeat of survival. Every mission felt like defiance carved into the clouds. The B-17 didn't win the war alone, but it changed how wars would be fought forever. It proved that courage and calculation, when bound by machinery and will, could break empires once thought untouchable. Rabaul was not just a target, it was a lesson, a warning to every power that believed fortifications, fleets, and arrogance could withstand the evolution of warfare. From the ashes of its ruins rose a new understanding, that the future of conflict would belong not to those who held ground, but to those who could command the sky. And yet, for all its might, the legacy of the Flying Fortress isn't written in victories or tonnage dropped. It's written in the quiet moments after the engines stopped, when crews climbed down from their shattered planes, counted their dead, and looked toward the horizon knowing they'd fly again tomorrow. History remembers the laughter of those who underestimated it, but it also remembers the silence that followed. In that silence, above the wreckage of Rabaul, in the drifting smoke and fading echoes, the age of the modern war was born. The age where iron and resolve could reach farther than any empire's pride, and where the Flying Fortress, once mocked as a myth, became a symbol, not of destruction alone, but of endurance, innovation, and the relentless will to rise.